All right, we've got one bill on the list today, and that is House
1021.
Bill 1021. Kick it over to council to explain the bill.
House Bill 1021 prohibits a licensed firearms dealer from conducting business and storing firearms at a location unless, 1, the premises on which the licensed dealer operates is equipped with specified security features, or 2, outside of business hours, the licensed dealer locks all firearms stored on the premises in a vault, safe, or a room or building that meets specified requirements. The Secretary of State Police must adopt rules and regulations to determine whether a licensed dealer has met these requirements. A violator is subject to a maximum civil penalty of $1,000 imposed by the Secretary. In addition to the civil penalty, a person who knowingly and willfully violates the bill's provisions is subject to, for a second offense, suspension of the person's dealer's license, and for a third or subsequent offense, revocation of the person's dealer's license. These penalties do not apply if the equipment or alarm system became temporarily inoperable at no fault of the licensed dealer. The Secretary must suspend the dealer's license if the licensee is found in violation of a second offense of the bill's provisions, and revoke the dealer's license if found in a third or subsequent offense of the bill's provisions.
Jimmy, just some questions for you. And I'll just give you the page number and the line, make it easier. Page 3, line 18. We list bars. It's not defined in here, right?
No.
So somebody installs I've seen bars on windows that anything, smaller than your little finger, of course I have a fat little finger, but smaller than your little finger, to pretty hefty bars on a bank window.
Sure.
Who decides what's a bar that's adequate?
Well, with the bill provides that the Secretary of State Police would adopt regulations and rules to determine if somebody had met the requirements. That would seem to be something that would fall within the purview of the Secretary to determine whether that meets the criteria for a bar or a security screen. I think security screen was probably the better example. Is a screen door a security screen, or are we talking about something that's a little bit more durable or industrial?
Yeah. When the Secretary adopts rules and regulations, are they subject to the procedures of the what the hell is it, Administrative Procedures Code or whatever?
Right. So I guess AELR, is that
well, we ultimately review them, but is it like the Administrative Procedures Act? It'll never stop. The APA, whatever.
Oh, how that would be appealed?
No, I'm looking at, it says they shall adopt, but doesn't this need to say that they have to adopt them pursuant to, or is that not necessary, the Administrative Procedures Act, to say that the rulemaking process is the one that's provided for in statute?
I'm not entirely sure that I follow or really know the answer to that question.
So in different secretaries, different departments have rulemaking authority. Department of Health, for example, and when they do that, they have to follow the procedures set forth in the Administrative Procedures Act, which is buried somewhere in the code, on how they have to advertise, solicit input, allow for public meeting, public input, how long we have to advertise it for, et cetera, right, so that the regulations that they adopt are subject to public input before the.
Yeah.
So doesn't that have to be stated in here that they adopt them pursuant to the Administrative Procedures Act?
I don't believe so, and I sort of base that on just as a drafting matter. Throughout the code, different agencies are given authority to adopt rules and regulations, and I can't think of an example where there's a cross-reference that's specified there. But I'd be happy to take a look into it.
So then, and then the next line is line 26 on the same page. It says, if practicable, physical barriers designed to prevent the use of motor vehicles to breach all buildings where the firearms are stored. So, I mean, this would be a building by building approach, right? If it
I guess
says-
is your reading of that, the physical barriers are designed specifically for the building where firearms are stored, or is it, would the drafting be interpreted as a general, just that it's a barrier that's generally designed to prevent motor vehicles from breaching a building?
Well, I guess that's it. I mean, if every building has to have a specific barrier, but if your building's on a hill, do you, I mean, who is making it, it's saying if practicable, which would lead one to believe that this is a building by building approach. And then we're gonna pull someone's license if it's not how do we decide, who decides if it's practicable, and what's the appeal process? If, to appeal the secretary's decision that I have to put three foot thick concrete barriers around my store on Main Street.
Sure.
Or like, what if you have a store on the strip mall on the second floor?
I mean, it's possible that the secretary is gonna issue, I mean, it's possible that the secretary is gonna make a decision that the owner and the landlord are gonna say, no way, I'm not putting those in here. And maybe it wouldn't be practicable. So what's the appeal process to say this is not practicable?
Well, can I say, it's at least one, right? It doesn't have to be each of those things, is that correct?
No, there's the word and instead of or.
It's one of those things and then the other.
And the other.
Yeah.
So you could have a burglary system.
Well, you'd have to
You'd have
have
to have that.
that, and if
And
it
one
was
of these other things.
practicable, the physical barriers. As far as the appeal process, I would really have to look into that for you, Senator.
I mean, it just seems
yeah.
like this appears that we're going to have, every building is going to be going through a process of analyzing and determining whether their bars meet codes, their security screens are adequate, their commercial grade doors are the kind of commercial grade doors that the Secretary of Police wants, whether their gates are, I mean, we've all been around. There's a huge variety in bars, security screens, commercial grade metal doors, grates, and other physical barriers. And physical barriers are emerging every day in this violent world. So this looks like it's a building by building approach where you would have to go in with your plan, much like you would for a development advisory committee before the county on a zoning issue. You want to open up a liquor store, you're going to have to come in and we have to prove everything about your design, your layout. It looks like these are sort of a DAC process here for gun stores. And I'm just trying to understand how this is, how this works. Because these are existing buildings that are now going to have to go back and forth and assure compliance. So is there a hearing process set up by which the secretary, a store owner is going to go in and say, well, here's our plan, here's what we've done, here's our plan, or the secretary is going to roam around the state willy-nilly issuing out citations for, here's your citation for not having up bars, got it, done. Okay, here's your citation for not having security screens, got it, done. Here's your citation for not having commercial grade doors, okay, got that done. So now we're 2 years into trying to open up your gun store. They just keep handing out in seriatim different penalties, and it seems like there ought to be a process by which there's a hearing or something where people could submit their plans on this, rather than just having a secretary just basically shut you down for years on end. Yeah, I mean, much like you would do for any development plan. You come before, you submit your plan, here's my plan, and the secretary says, these three aren't good. You fix those, okay, boom, it's done. You've got it's done. I mean, that's how we do all development plans in all of our counties. And you get a plan approved for all these things. But the way this is written, it looks like they could keep violating you one and one and one and one. And of course, once you violated 2 of them or 3 of them, you can have your license revoked. There's not like a pre-approval, there's not a process to say, submit your plans. It's not in here. It's just you violated again. So how would that work?
Well, yeah, I'd really need to check with Department of State Police on the process that, you know, if they've even considered, I guess at this point, what process they would put in place as far as the rules and
But it
regulations.
wouldn't be there, yeah.
But
I mean,
there's
a statutory process for
right.
how.
And there's nothing specific in the bill that lays out sort of the process that you described, being either a pre-approval process or what the appeals process looks like. You know,
Would this be something, but I don't know how often these licenses are renewed. Would it say you have to submit with your license renewal a plan? But that's not in the statute.
that's
And then-
not in the statute. Yeah, that,
Right.
yeah.
So it's sort of up to the whim of the secretary. If they get to you, they get to you. If they don't, they don't. If they get you on barge this week and you work on that one for a while, they come back 2 months later and say, oh, now we're going to get you on security screenings. Come back 3 months later and say, oh, now we're enforcing grates. And come back 3 months after that, oh, now we're enforcing barriers. And meanwhile, you've been shut down for 1, now you've been shut down for 2, now you've been shut down for 3. And a year later, you're finally you've hit all the dimes and you're trying to open. So we'd have no process like that, okay. And then, a couple more questions. And we-
When is the license renewal? How often do you have to renew your license?
The same question on page 4, line 1, refers to a vault and a safe, and then there's a room that meets the requirements of a vault or a safe. So again, I take it that the secretary will do a rulemaking process to determine what the requirements are for a vault or a safe.
Well, so actually, just, you know, a clarification there. In line 3, where it says a room or a building that meets the requirements under item 1 of the subsection, that item 1 is actually referring to the previous page, where you've got,
All the requirements.
right, so it's capable of filming and recording at least one of the following
Right.
features, right? So that's the room or the building would have those. And as far as, you know, what is a,
Can you explain that room? I don't understand either. The room
Right.
is, what's the requirement for the room? Because that was one of my questions.
well, I mean, so there was some feedback from, I believe it was National Shooting Sports Foundation, that there was some question about whether, how that would work as far as a room that met all of those requirements, because the room would need, you know, to have the filming equipment, which is, you know, that I think makes sense in the context of a room.
The room has to meet what requirements?
The requirements between lines 10 and, let's see, 28 on page 3.
So it has to have one of the 5 there in this room?
Right.
Wouldn't the room then just be the store at that point?
I think that was sort of the question that the Shooting Sports Foundation was having.
Because if the whole store has to meet one of those requirements, then you have to have a room at the store that meets the requirements of the store. So what's wrong with, that room portion is totally unnecessary, is it not? If the store has to meet a requirement, why are we saying then you have to have a room that meets the same requirements as the store? It strikes me as completely superfluous. I think what they were originally trying to say was you had to have a secure room, and then somebody pointed out it's undefined, so they struck secured room, and they're saying, well, a room that meets all the requirements of the store. So it's,
What's this room or building? So the building already met the requirements, right?
yeah, that's what I'm saying,
Yeah.
so the room is strikes me as completely superfluous. But maybe they want it in there because they say, well, that just means you don't have to do anything. Never mind, leave it in, I'm fine with that.
All right.
It's a good amendment, never mind.
Okay. Then I have a question on page 4, line 6. It says this subsection, meaning the fines, I guess, that are, let's see, if you don't do this, you're subject to a $1,000 fine. But this is saying this fine does not apply if the system became temporarily inoperable at no fault of the licensed dealers, right?
So there's an implication there that it needs to be working. So if you go back up to the previous page, let's see, where it lines 24 and 25, a burglary alarm system that's continually monitored. If it were inoperable, obviously it would no longer be monitored. So the exception there would seem to be that it doesn't apply if the equipment or alarm system became temporarily inoperable at no fault of the licensed dealer.
Okay, but then if I take that, so if I look back up at the first part of this statute, under 5114, they could still suspend or revoke the license for non-functioning alarm, but you couldn't get a $1,000 fine.
Yeah, I think that's a correct reading of that, because the exception applies just to the subsection, and that's talking
Right.
about, well, no, because they couldn't suspend it, because that's all of subsection B. So the subsection does not apply if the equipment or alarm system became temporarily inoperable. So that's, and subsection B does provide for the suspension, at least for a person who knowingly and willfully violates.
Okay, I'm not clear. So this is this subsection, meaning
Subsection B.
5, no, I guess B, right?
Right.
Subsection B. You don't get a fine. This subsection does not apply if the equipment became temporarily inoperable at no fault of the dealer. And then the subsection provides that you can get a $1,000 fine if it was inoperable from no fault of the dealer. However, if I go back on page 2 of the bill and we talk about 5114 and the suspensions or revocations, you could still get suspended or revoked your license if it became inoperable through no fault of the licensed dealers, but you wouldn't be subject to a $1,000 fine.
Yeah, I see what you're saying, Senator. I mean, so in 5114, it does say found in violation of a second offense under 5145.1 of the subtitle. But, I mean, if you go to 5145 of the subtitle, and down in B where it is talking about the penalties, if you
Wait, do
go
we have
down-
5145 on this bill?
That's the new,
Line 5.
I'm sorry, page. Which one? Excuse me. Page.
so it's page 4, and if you go down to line 14, so this is the,
Wait, maybe I'm looking at the wrong edition here. I'm looking at the House Bill 1021.
Yeah,
Right.
If you go on the laptop, just look at the third reader version. I mean, when it says this subsection does not apply, it says on line 5, right? The equipment alarm system became temporarily inoperable.
it does, but if you go down to line 14, that's where it talks about the suspension, and that's for the second and subsequent offenses, gets into the suspension and revocation. So there's a requirement there that a person knowingly and willfully violate the section, and then you're talking about for their second offense, they're subject to a suspension, and for a third or subsequent offense, a revocation of their dealer's license. So reading that in conjunction with the earlier provision that we were talking about that's being added to the existing law, where we're talking about requirement that the secretary suspend a dealer's license, that seems to suggest that, you know, that suspension for the second violation still wouldn't apply. It's drafted a little funny because it talks about a violation of a second offense, but doesn't talk about any subsequent offenses. But I think you would have to read that in conjunction, and that exception would still apply, even to the suspension. But looking at it, it is drafted a little interestingly, because it says in 5114 is found in violation of a second offense under 5145.1 of the subtitle, but it doesn't say a second or subsequent offense. And 5145 talks about second and subsequent offenses. So I think from a drafting perspective, that may not match up entirely.
Okay, I'm just not following, because it appears to say to me rather clearly that, I mean, I'm trying to, I took the third, I'm looking at the reprint, that's 213222, is that what you're looking at?
It's not a reprint, Senator. I was looking at the bill as printed for third reading, which is,
Okay. I thought
if you're
yeah, I just pulled that up. Mm-hmm. The words 5145 appear? 5145.1. Oh, no, I said, it's 5114 and 51, yeah, .1, that's not 51. Okay, 5-145.1 is not 5-145, right?
right.
Okay, so I've got the current, I am looking at the current edition, and the current edition does clearly say to me that the fine section does not apply if the equipment becomes temporarily inoperable, but it seems to me to clearly indicate that the suspension and revocation provisions would apply. So what's your argument, that the suspension and revocations provisions would not apply?
Well, and the only reason I say that is because if you're looking at page 4
Yeah.
for that exception. If you go down further on page 4, there's a reference after the that $1,000 fine. There's a reference to, starting at line 14. That's where the bill starts talking about the suspension of a dealer's license for second and subsequent offenses. So that's all part of subsection B, that suspension provision. So that exception that says the subsection doesn't apply, that exception also applies to that second and subsequent suspension and revocation.
Yeah, but this is knowing and willful violations.
Right.
The first one is just, the first one doesn't require a mens rea or anything like that. The first, the
Just says for-
5114 just says they shall suspend, they shall revoke if is found in violation of a second offense. Then you come back to the last page we're looking at now, and it talks about knowingly and willfully violates.
Right.
So how?
I agree, the drafting doesn't match up there. I mean, there's a
Yes,
disconnect between.
It's a total disconnect.
Sure.
I could be violating one and not violating the other, but I could get my license suspended or revoked because my alarm went out, because the electricity went down because of a major storm. Or the guy just went bankrupt and I didn't know it. The guy providing the alarm service, or he forgot somebody was negligent on his end. Then I get mine either suspended or revoked. And then we're saying, yeah, but if it was this provides additional penalties if it was intentional and willful. But I still got my license revoked and it was accidental. Right? or suspended? It looks to me like a major disconnect between the two halves of the statute. And it looks like in the second half, there was some attempt to give some level of leniency, which is not reflected in the first half of the bill, or the law. I just think we need to do an amendment so that there's a single standard if we're going to do this. And I think we also, well, I just want to make sure that you're clear also that that we don't need to say, I'm not, does the Secretary of State please otherwise engage in rulemaking, or is this their first venture into that? Do we otherwise require them to issue rules and regulations?
Other parts of the code, yes.
Okay. And do we know, are there rules and regulations subject to the Administrative Procedures Act?
I would assume that they are. I need to double check.
Okay.
Just on how that process works.
Yeah, because that's intended to provide public notice, and also the industry can chime in and feel like they're getting a bit of due process in all of this.
Testimony, pro and con. I'm sorry, I'm not very adept with my computer. I'm trying to figure how I can review the testimony in the House.
Just put it in your floor system. Put it, go to your floor system.
Go to the floor system?
Yeah,
Senate floor system?
yeah,
And if you
yeah, go in there.
log into your floor system, at the top, you can search for the bill. There's a search window for, you can type in House HB 1021.
And then the committee testimony tab.
At the top of the screen.
Okay, wait a minute, okay. Now, so I'm,
1021, it's House Bill 1021.
so what do? I go to
Go to
menu?
menu.
Go to menu?
Yeah,
Yeah.
House Bill 1021.
Type in HB 1021. Okay.
Now, committee testimony tab up there, on the right, far right.
Oh, wow.
Oh,
Okay, all right. Thank you. Well, you learn something every day.
okay.
Support against oral. Tatella, no testimony, unfavorable. Nelda Fink, testimony. Thomas Kasuba.
Opposition testimony that we don't this doesn't differentiate between different types of firearm dealers. So somebody who deals in curios and collectors and relics license will be subject to, with a small shop dealing in those would be required, and some of those are even out of their homes, would be required to put up barriers and fences and bars on their houses and stuff, even though all they do is curios and relics. I mean,
So this is licensed dealers, and that's the businesses that are licensed to deal regulated firearms. Now, that also would apply to, that requirement applies to people who are the gunsmiths who also work on regulated firearms. But if they're,
How many
Yeah.
people, so you were saying,
house, I gotta put bars up?
so there are, I spoke with state police, and there are licensed dealers who are, they don't have storefronts. They do have, they operate out of
By
their.
me, gunsmiths are out of their house all the time. So if it's a gunsmith, okay, to be honest, I was sitting here trying to figure out if this bill actually did anything, because my honest take is, I can't figure out what it would do that a normal gun store wouldn't already do. So honestly, I think they got their amendments on, and they're probably like, this is fine, because I can't figure out, like, a burglary alarm system that is continually monitored. Yeah, I have ADT on my house for $90 a year that does that or whatever. So, but the difference is, if you are, I'm trying to figure out who this negatively impacts. If you are one of these gunsmiths or people that's selling 2 or 3 out of your house, yeah, that's a problem, because who the hell's gonna have bars, security screens, commercial grade doors, grates? Nobody's gonna put this on their house.
The, between item 1, so if you're looking at, just on page 3, A1 is one possible requirement, or avenue of satisfying the bill's requirements.
Premises facility is operated.
So that's all of those things that you were just talking about,
License
Senator.
may not conduct business in store firearms located unless the premise is located like this. Equipped security, including equipment of filming or recording, at least one of the following features.
so you,
So
Wouldn't they need something in your house that's 1 through 5?
Or if you go down to the bottom of the page, at line 28, it says, or outside of business hours, the licensed dealer locks all firearms stored on the premises in a vault, a safe, or a room or building that meets the requirements under
Okay,
item
so
1.
basically,
So the vault and the safe are probably the.
so that's the same for a store too?
Right, so a store, or if you had like the licensee that operated out of their home, that, right.
So basically, the whole bill just says, if you sell guns outside of your business hours, you gotta lock them in a safe or vault. Or if you're a store, you have to have one of the 5 requirements that I would believe you would already have. That's kind of, is that a good summary of the bill, where we're standing at?
Yeah, there are other requirements in there, but those are sort of 2 avenues of satisfying it. You can either do everything that's in item 1, which is the filming equipment, the burglar alarm, and then the one of the 5, and if practicable, the physical barriers to designed to prevent breach by a motor vehicle, or you can just outside of business hours lock all the firearms
Yeah,
stored
but
on premises.
the physical barriers is totally unnecessary, because if you can get out of that super easily. The physical barrier part is like non-existent in the bill. You don't even need it in the bill, because it says, or a vault or safe, which the home guys are gonna do, or a room that meets the above 5, meets the requirements above, which every gun store is gonna meet those requirements above. So the physical barrier part is totally superfluous, unnecessary in the bill. The way this bill's been amended up, it's just a lot of it's superfluous. So if you break down what the bill actually does, my reading of it now says if you are one of these gunsmiths, you gotta put it in a vault or a safe at night or when you're not using them, which I would imagine most of these guys probably do, because they don't want somebody breaking in their house stealing this stuff. And then the gun stores are already gonna meet these requirements above. I'm sure they don't want it, because somebody could come in, the state police, if you get a real anti-gun governor and superintendent, they could go in and harass these people and come up with regs to put them out of business. But I'm having a hard time seeing, though, the plain reading of the law, what it actually does.
Physical barriers too quickly, because it's in there twice. Look on page 3, it's in on page 3, line 22, and it's also in on page 3, on line 26, that so one, it's an alternate to bars, security screens, gates, et cetera. It's one of those alternate, but then when you get down to line 26, if practical, meaning if the superintendent thinks you need to have it, if it's practicable, meaning it wouldn't like totally destroy the building or something, or fall through onto your neighbor's roof, through the floor. So practicable is a very subjective term. It's whether the state superintendent's person who comes out, if they're a very impractical person, they would find everything to be practicable. And then you'd have to litigate all the stuff about physical barriers intending to prevent the use of motor vehicles to breach all buildings where firearms are stored. So that's everything, and that's a huge discretionary piece for the state police to come in and say, no.
But the way that they're, I think, to be honest, I think the House realized that the physical barriers is not a workable standard, and I think what they were trying to do is basically, without striking it, getting out of it. I agree with you. I don't think the bill is well written, but if you look at it, they said or outside of business hours, and that's where it gets to the homesmith will lock it in vault or safe. And then what they did is 3, a room, which the room can become your whole store, which then you'll hit the requirements 1 through 5. I'm just saying, you're right. Somebody could get in and interpret this one way or another, but I think what they were trying to do is, clearly the testimony came in, showed the physical barriers was not workable, because I don't know if every Dick's Sporting Good or Walmart has physical barriers in front of their store. I mean, it's just not a workable standard. So I think they were trying to get out of it. If you were going to draft this correctly, you would just strike physical barriers completely out of the bill. That would be more sense. That's what I think they're trying to do. Basically trying to give that back without admitting it was unworkable. I mean, you got a bill that came in, it was clearly problematic. You had the gun folks come in, show them why it was problematic, and this is them trying to escape and keep a bill moving forward with, it's drafted, it's problematic the whole way it's drafted. It's confusing and all that, but.
You have to have an amendment to make the suspension and revocation pieces in the second half of the bill match the existing law in the first half of the bill.
I mean, but here's a question for people who want to build. Why do you even want physical barriers is completely unnecessary in this bill right now. There's no, can someone give me a rationale why we're going to pass it with physical barriers? Because it's clearly the House did an or in there to allow you to completely get out from underneath of it. No one's going to do physical barriers in this bill. It's just unnecessary and superfluous to have it in there. Okay, but so the problem is, no one's going to do physical barriers under the way the bill's written, though. The or will allow them to escape, because people realized we can't, you're not going to shut down every Dick's Sporting Goods and Walmarts from selling guns.
Let me just have to do it from here. Okay.
Jamie, maybe you can help me with this. I know that I've been in many dealers when they're inspected, right? And they come in and they look at the way they're storing their firearms. There is already things in play. Could you go down a list of what the state police inspects and looks at right now that would differentiate how this bill is differently than what they currently inspect?
You know, I would honestly have to reach out to state police to to give you an accurate answer on that, Senator.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Jamie, I've now pulled up the testimony of Mark Pennick, who I always find interesting because he clearly knows his stuff. This was in the House, and I just want to read you what he says in one small portion of his testimony. He says, "The bill as thus written applies to individual Class 03 dealers of curio and relics. Class 3 dealers are collectors and use their Class 3 license simply to trade or add to their own private collections of vintage firearms. Under federal law, a curio or relic is defined as those firearms which are at least 50 years old or are of special interest to collectors by reason of some quality other than is associated with firearms intended for sporting use or as offensive or defensive weapons. Like other types of personal collections, such Class B dealer collections are typically stored in the homes of the dealers. This bill would thus require Class 3 dealers to install bollards or other types of physical barriers around their homes, as well as implement the other security measures specified." Do you agree with him on this?
Sure, I do, Senator, because the curios license for the FFLs, that's more of a collector's license than it is a dealer's license. The law under state law, so we're differentiating FFLs who are federal licensees from state licensees. Now, some dealers have both, some only have the FFL. You need the state license in order to deal regulated firearms, because that's what the state regulates.
But the
And
Class 3 licenses, aren't they?
The Class
Do they go
3s
to
are-
dealers of curio and relics?
Right, so those are the relics and curios. That's more, I believe that's more of a collector license than it is a
Right,
dealer license.
that's what he says.
But
But is there any way we could exclude those particular Class 3 dealers from the bills?
See, I
So they
don't-
wouldn't have to put bollards around their houses?
I don't think that, so it's, I guess, a bit of a loaded answer, but let me just go over the requirement for, like, who the licensees in Maryland are that we're talking about
It
under
says
the bill.
licensed dealers, right?
So the licensed dealer, current law provides that a person needs a license if they are engaged in the business of selling, renting, or transferring regulated firearms.
Mr.
and
Pennick
they need
says
to-
that licensed dealer is not a term that's defined in the Maryland law. Is there some place in Maryland law that specifically defines a licensed dealer?
Well, we're talking about the regulated firearms dealers, so that, right, the bill doesn't get into that, but based on where it's going to in the law, we're talking about the licensed regulated firearms dealers.
So that would exclude Class 3 dealers of curio and relics?
I believe it would, because unless they're engaged in, and I think they would need some other federal licensure, like a Type 1. I see Senator Bailey.
Yeah, that's the difference right there. And I think it does apply to them, right? Because as a dealer, you can people use their dealer's license to purchase firearms.
They do. They can.
Right. And because that's the way that they get around buying a limited amount of guns in a certain
Right.
time period, all you have to do is be a dealer. There are dealers that never sell firearms, and this would apply to them.
Well, the
I think.
ATF licensure process on that is I think for all but the Type 3s, and I'm referring to the curios and collectors, I'm pretty sure you have to be in the business of buying and selling firearms in order to qualify for the other, or manufacturing if you're under one of the other license types. But I think even on the FFL application, it differentiates and asks, are you just applying for this license to enhance your own personal collection? And I think that roots somebody out if they are.
So you're saying there's a requirement that says they have to sell a firearm to be a dealer?
Going into the requirements to become an FFL and what type of FFL, yeah, it's my understanding that you actually would have to be in the business of buying and selling firearms depending on which license type you're going for at the federal
So
level.
I don't disagree with you that buying is fine, but selling, right? I don't think when you apply for that license, you don't have to list, nor do they come by and say, how many guns did you sell? Right? They don't expect it
No.
for the number of guns that you sell. And if you never sell a gun, they don't take your dealer's license away.
No, that's
Right?
correct.
So this would clearly apply to people that are just enhancing their collection.
Well, and I think sort of to get to the question that Senator West was asking about, would this apply to people who are operating out of their homes? So regardless of the answer to, does it apply to the curios and collectors for the type 3, the question is, does it apply to, say, somebody who is an FFL and is a state licensed regulated firearms dealer who doesn't have a storefront and instead operates maybe even infrequently out of their home? And the answer is yes. It would apply to both the storefront and the non-storefront dealers. Okay.
We'll do a roll call, and you and I are gonna talk more about.
Vice Chair Waldstreicher.
Yes.
Senator Lee.
What's the point of having so voted?
Yeah, why did we do all this shit? Why did we waste it out? We could've come in here at 9:59 and voted this.
party line vote. Can you take me off for a second?